This panel has been a genuine treat to be a part of, as somebody who's spent a good chunk of both his professional and his devotional life trying to understand the complex interplay of texts and history and revelation. I've been inspired and enriched by this morning's panelists. Ken Jackson's piece is really a rather excellent way to begin this morning's discussion. His work reminds us that a combination of an ancient text and a living revelation was present at the very beginning of Joseph's development and prophetic career. The first vision was the result of text and experience, of history and immediacy, and what was present at the beginning persisted throughout the prophet's ministry. Jackson compels us to see the Doctrine and Covenants as a work in constant conversation with the ancient scriptures of the Bible, reminding us that the restoration was never intended to be or to be understood as a creation ex nihilo, but was from the very beginning supposed to be, in large measure, an amplifying engagement with extant truths. Similarly, in Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, the present experience of inspiration and the mediated experience of textual engagement combine to educate the prophet about ancient things. And the most important truth Joseph learned about the ancient world through this process is that a precise knowledge of the gospel of Jesus Christ had been present, and necessarily so, from the very beginning of God's work upon the earth. More on this in just a moment. Perhaps Jackson's most important insight is that Joseph never saw himself as doing violence to the text. He was never imposing on it, in his mind, external meanings, but only ever unlocking its true essence. Now, this assertion of Jackson's has been richly complicated by the next paper, where Jackson provides us with a rich overview of the prophet's inspired engagement with the Bible. Nicholas Frederick zeroes in more specifically on his relationship with the Gospel of John, and indeed, in a way that you can only talk about with Joseph Smith, with the author of the Gospel of John. Frederick places Joseph and John in a collaborative relationship. Most fascinatingly, a relationship whose vectors of influence flow both directions. Both supernaturally revealed and naturally transmitted texts from John correct modern misperceptions, even as modern inspirations correct ancient texts. Frederick also demonstrates that the prophet's relationship with John evolved over time, from one that rested primarily on introductory rhetoric to one of greater and greater substance, ultimately culminating in the King Follett Discourse. I confess I have usually thought of the late Nauvoo theology as moving farther away, or perhaps more precisely beyond, the constraints of the New Testament. But Frederick's paper raises the interesting suggestion to me that perhaps what we're seeing in a moment like the King Follett Discourse is in fact a deepening of Joseph's long-standing relationship with the Bible. Frederick here suggests that the King Follett Discourse is not so much Joseph surpassing John, but rather it is two prophets continuing to embrace each other in a conversation across dispensations in a way that deepens insight and understanding. It's a remarkable suggestion in that paper. Justin Bray then took us into a discussion of the Antebellum debate about the office of the 70 disciples. Over the years, I've spent a good deal of time thinking and writing about how antebellum Americans understood their time and place in relation to the times and places of the Bible, trying to make sense of how they determined which of the biblical precedents were intended to be permanent and universal, and which were intended to be temporary and local, limited to the location and era of the primitive church. I must confess, however, that I had never even thought about the 70 as such a rich and revealing point of examination in this regard. Bray brilliantly shows that it is a splendidly rich point of entry into these questions, and I commend him for identifying it as such a rich object of inquiry. Bray demonstrates this fascinating tension between those who believed biblical precedent was intended to empower moderns and those who felt that, in this case, time and circumstance had changed to the extent that the 70 had no relevance for the post-crucifixion world. Not only does Bray's work speak to the history of the Latter-day Saints, who see in this episode another example of the power of a living revelation to cut through the unending exegetical squabbles of the textually bound in a way that restores life and immediacy to the text. The significance of Bray's work goes beyond this. The question at the center of his paper, the matter of which aspects of the Bible are intended to persist and which were of temporary application, is actually a matter of monumental significance in the study of the early national United States. This question comes up again and again and again in an age of social reform, speaking to matters of women's religious role or temperance or any number of other reform issues. Most importantly, it is found at the center of the American people's exegetical fight over slavery. And Bray's paper becomes an excellent example of the ways in which issues which we may feel hold interest for a relatively small and insular group of Mormon historians, namely a quorum of the 70, for heaven's sake, actually has the potential to shed immense light on matters which interest students of the past generally. And this is a point about the larger significance of our work, which we neglect to our detriment and to the detriment of the larger discipline. Matthew Bowman's paper is an extraordinarily strong example of this point. The tension between community and individual has been at the root of American religious history from its very beginning. The Venerable Edmund Morgan once referred to this as the Puritan Dilemma. But Bowman showed us this morning it goes well beyond the Puritans or any other specific group. It affected the way antebellum Americans thought about themselves and their history. Bowman's use of Mosheim and Milner as the two anchor points of his study, Mosheim representing the institutional corporate aspect of church history, Milner representing the aspect of church history that celebrates the heroism of the individual conscience, is brilliant. That he is able to show how Mormons use these very authorities in their own instrumental use and invocation of Christian history is even more impressive, as it demonstrates how Mormons themselves struggled with the paradox of Protestant history, a history that celebrated the courage of conscience-driven protest, but also so desperately needed the reinforcing and stabilizing bond of orthodoxy. Mormons themselves inherited this Puritan dilemma that actually, as Mosheim and Milner demonstrated, long predated the Puritans and survived well after them. How they used and grappled with that inheritance and ultimately attempted to turn it to their apologetic advantage as they explained why it was necessary to have a restored church with living revelation and living spiritual gifts to mediate this tension between individual conscience and institutional authority, is a matter of profound interest to both Mormon historians and historians of Christianity generally. I've intentionally left Sam Brown's presentation to the end here because I believe it provides a very inviting opportunity to consider this panel collectively. The overarching idea of the Prisca Theologia is that there are truths that survive, persist, and transcend, that tie peoples and places together. Now, I'm shamelessly appropriating the material Sam gave us, with apologies to him, and maybe stretching it beyond recognition. But he used the Prisca Theologia to push beyond our familiar community of understanding and discourse, to remind us that truth is a dogged and happy traveler. Each of the papers here touch on that idea to some extent, the first two in obvious ways, the latter two a bit more obliquely. Kent Jackson argues that Joseph saw a Christian truth that long predated the Christian dispensation, that there is a salvific link of knowledge and yearning and requirement that runs throughout human experience, despite some breaks for apostasy, but that it runs essentially and persistently from beginning to end. Nicholas Frederick presents this notion in his discussion of a Joe 9 engagement by Joseph Smith. In arguing that Joseph, not so much arguing, but suggesting that Joseph may not have been so much drawing from the language of John, but that John and Joseph sound alike because they are both drawing from the same sacred word, namely the life and language of Jesus Christ. Like the notion of the Prisca Theologia that Sam has so ably instructed us in today, Nicholas suggests that the similarities between religions, between John and Joseph, might reflect phrasing that persists across dispensations because it shares a common source. not because of a mortal and natural influence across time, but because of a shared link to the infinite. Bray and Bowman speak to the underlying concept of Brown's discussion in a slightly different way. Brown begins by asking if true and lasting answers can be found outside the church. The papers of Bray and Bowman suggest that true and lasting questions can be found beyond the boundaries of a church history symposium. They do this, they speak to basic human questions that persist across time and space, such questions as, which aspects of religion are transient and which are intended to be permanent? How does time affect eternity? How do churches encourage both individual integrity and community cohesion? These are big, lasting questions. And this panel is a powerful reminder that the work pursued by LDS scholars has the potential to resonate well beyond the Wasatch Front, even beyond Far West or Nauvoo or Kirtland or Palmyra. What we do in symposia such as these is so important. We may think we are pursuing our questions, but whether we are aware of it or not, we are actually providing insight on the questions. May this effort and our commitment to it long live. Thank you.